Hello everybody, welcome to Module 2. This module comprises what would normally be, in a full 15-week semester, about 6 weeks of the course. So we are running at full speed to get through our summer session. This module begins with a conversation around race and the impact that race has on schooling in America. This is a topic that is its own course offered in some departments on campus. So we're really doing an overview. Feel free when you're in the discussion boards to link to other resources that you might have read in other classes that you think enhance the discussion. I will certainly be doing that, offering some suggestions for other reading. But the way that I've kind of narrowed it down to frame and discuss race and equity education in this course follows kind of two threads. One has to do with the school to prison pipeline. There's an article linked from the National Education Association, NEA, that discusses the school to prison pipeline problem, kind of tries to identify some reasons for the problem, some ways that it manifests, and offer some solutions. People will have opinions about this. You might be in a school doing some of the things that they are talking about in this article, or you may be witnessing some of the less than positive things that they talk about in the article. Bring all of that to the discussion boards. And I'll probably be tossing in some additional resources around the school to prison pipeline. There's some great videos out there that kind of enhance our understanding of that, but I didn't make them official pieces of the course, just trying to keep things, in check, because we only have so much time in our lives. The second thread that we're going to go down as we explore race has to do with the achievement gap, because that's one of the ways that race and equity education tends to get framed in policy discussions on the federal level, the state level, also just among teachers with the standardized testing protocols, the pushes towards more scripted curricula. All of this kind of boils down to this idea of the achievement gap. No Child Left Behind was, a lot of language about the achievement gap. Race to the Top, there's a lot of language about the achievement gap. Whatever comes next, I'm sure there will be a lot of language about the achievement gap. So we've got two articles that unpack the idea of the achievement gap, because it's something it's demonstrable statistically, but there's more to it than that. And so both of these articles sort of challenge the dominant narrative around the achievement gap. Noguera and ACOM are talking about it with this idea of opportunity gaps. Delpit, which many of you may have already read, so maybe this is a gimme, this reading. Her piece is talking about there being no achievement gap at birth. And so it's countering this idea that the achievement gap has to do with inherent failures of certain races or certain groups of people. From that, we transition into a discussion around ethnicity, which intersects with race, but they aren't exactly the same thing. Race, when we talk about race, we're talking about phenotype. We're talking about, but it's sort of a culturally constructed concept in a lot of ways, the idea of race. Ethnicity is the same thing, but it's not exactly the same thing. For example, Latinos can be white, they can be black, they can be of indigenous descent, right? So you can have a lot of different races within an ethnicity. And so there can be some overlap there. But rather than get hung up on what race is versus what ethnicity is and trying to put them in separate boxes, we're just going to kind of talk about it all together. Midubiche's article looks at the idea of ethnicity through the lens of immigration status and nationality and xenophobia, which is very pertinent right now because we have legislators in various states, particularly border states, challenging the notion that we should be educating the children of immigrants or people who may not be full legal citizens of our country. And this article talks about the legal history of the choice that our nation made to educate all children regardless of nationality and citizenship status. Then we have two pieces that are talking about, that are kind of going on another thread along those lines, looking at English language learners. And I'm going to kind of unpack some of that terminology for you because I know that some of that may be new for you. And we'll need to know what all these different acronyms stand for as we're looking at the creating ELL friendly classrooms piece and the videos about ELL experiences. So ELL stands for English Language Learner. This is sort of the standard term that you're going to be seeing. EFL stands for English as a Foreign Language. That's referring to English being taught to speakers of other languages in other countries. ESL means English as a second language, and it's a term that you will run into sometimes when talking about classes in the United States for speakers of other languages. It fell out of vogue because not all people in quote unquote ESL classes are learning English as a second language. They may be learning it as a third, fourth, fifth, sixth language. And so it sort of reflected this idea that we had about these people that are coming here, and that, oh, well, they clearly only know one other language, right? So English is going to be their second language. It was kind of diminishing what we thought their background knowledge might actually be. TESOL stands for English for Speakers of Other Languages, and the T means teaching, right? English for speakers of other languages. This is sort of the newer term that we find ourselves using more often, along with ELL, to talk about this population of students. LEP stands for Limited English Proficiency, and Limited English Proficiency is a designation that students can have regardless of whether they are being officially served in English for speakers of other language programs. It's a designation that just means that their English is not where we would expect their language skills to be for their age and grade level. ELP stands for English Language Proficiency, and this is a term that is used in standards and assessments put out by the organizations that do that kind of thing. So you might run into that terminology as well. Other ways that we talk about students who are English language learners or who have limited English proficiency is in terms of the level of bilingualism or multilingualism that they have. So sometimes we call them emergent bilingual. Emergent bilingual is just another way to describe an English language learner. And it doesn't necessarily mean that that second language is English. So I am actually a Spanish teacher by trade. That's what I've spent a lot of years doing. And so I can talk about my Spanish students as being emergent bilingual, even though they're native English speakers. I'm speaking about it in terms of their Spanish language abilities. But because it does use the phrase bilingual, it's assuming that only two languages are part of the equation. So sometimes instead of that, you'll see bi or multilingual or bi or multiliterate. And I think these terms are important because they distinguish between the idea of lingual and literate, right? Literacy, being biliterate or multiliterate, means that you can read and write in that language. And this is a whole different set of skills than being able to speak a language or interpret orally a language, right? We know that young children are lingual before they are ever literate, and they can be, somebody can be quite fully lingual and not literate at all. And so we have to be careful that we're not conflating those terms when we're talking about students and their families, frankly, who may not have the English language skills of someone who was born and raised here and didn't have a heritage language that was something other than English. A dual immersion or dual language program is a style of teaching where usually it's bilingual because it's dual immersion. So we're teaching students literacy skills and content, so science, social studies, math, in two languages simultaneously. So they might have half of their day in Spanish, say, and then half of their day in English, and they would be receiving content instruction in both of those languages. Sometimes they will divide up these kinds of programs where, like, they have, let's say they have an English class and a Spanish class, then they also have social studies being taught in Spanish, science being taught in English, math being taught in one language or the other, art being taught in one language or the other. So it's, maybe a little more formally structured which languages are taught or which subjects are taught in which language. English-only programs are where all instruction is provided in English and there's very little accommodation for students who have limited English proficiency. These programs, we're cyclical. We like everything else, it's a cycle in terms of what's the most popular. But as you might well imagine, the idea of English only is also a political idea, right? The idea that we shouldn't be making accommodations or serving people who don't speak our language when they come to our country. And so a lot of times as political tides swing against immigrant populations, you will see a shift in educational policy that moves back towards English-only programs and away from accommodations and extra programs that promote bilingualism or simply serve English language and limited English proficiency students. L1 is a term that you might see when we're talking about language learners, and it refers to students' dominant language. So my L1 is English, for example. My students in my Spanish classes, L1 is English. Our L2s are the language that we're trying to acquire. So for my students who are English speakers trying to learn Spanish, Spanish is their L2. But for an ELL, their L2 is going to be English. L1 and L2 doesn't specifically mean that these are that they only have two languages. It's simply referring to the dominant language and the language we're trying to acquire in the classroom setting. A heritage or home language is sometimes they're L1, but sometimes not. But it's the language that's spoken in the student's home or their kind of immediate community. So I've also taught a lot of heritage language learners, which is something that a term we use in Guilford County to describe students who were raised with some level of home language, being typically for us it's Spanish, right? So we're trying to improve their Spanish, but we're teaching it a little bit differently than we would a traditional foreign language class. But for a lot of those students, frankly, their L1 is English because they've spent so much time immersed in the English language through school and ELL programs and TV and media that their dominant language is English, but their parents may only speak Spanish. So their heritage or home language may not always be their L1. Code switching is a term that we run into kind of crossing all of these themes, actually: race, ethnicity, and actual language. Specifically, linguistically speaking, code switching is the ability or the tendency to use different languages or dialects based on the context of the conversation. So people who are bilingual or bidialectical, if they're with a peer group who they know speaks like a Chicano English, they're going to speak a Chicano English, versus when they're in an academic setting with a teacher who speaks a very sort of academic English, they're going to try and code switch back into a more academic English, versus at home where they may be speaking Spanish, for example, or whatever, right? It's this idea that you can move back and forth between these dialects and these ways of speaking and these different languages or grammar structures. Sometimes it has to do with tonal registers or dialects of the same language. So like this idea of switching between standard English, quote unquote, or the idea of African American English. There's a whole different grammar structure and terminologies and slangs that are employed with peer groups or at home or in a certain space in the community versus in other spaces in the community. Another term that we run into sometimes is the idea of first generation, second generation, and so on. First generation students were not born in the United States, whereas second generation students are born in the United States but to parents who are not. And so we see these terms come up in current conversations around immigration status, nationality, citizenship, but also historically, because we're a nation of immigrants, and so these terms have always kind of been part of our national dialogue around how we educate and how we classify the kids that are coming into our classrooms and their families, for that matter, when it comes to services that they're going to receive and the kind of equity education that they're going to have access to. These readings and in the discussion boards to help you kind of understand what you're talking about, what the reading's talking about, and what everybody else is talking about. I'll see you in the discussion boards, and feel free to email me anytime if you have any questions or need any more background information to really get the most out of these conversations.